Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our second webinar as part of Fleet Management Awareness Month. I have a few announcements to go through before we get started with the presentation. And in the meantime, you'll notice that there is a poll question on your screen. If you could answer that poll question, I will share the results of the poll in just a moment. Okay, also, so I want to let everyone know that I am recording this session today. So you will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation, but there are a couple of ways to ask those questions, whether or not you'd like to be anonymous with your question. The first option is to ask a question out loud. Everyone is in a mute mode at this time, so if you have a question that you'd like to ask out loud, in the dashboard that you see through the GoToWebinar tool, next to your name, there's a hand icon. If you press that hand icon, that basically notifies me that you're going to have a question, and I will unmute you at an appropriate time so that you can ask that question out loud. If you are on the telephone and you have not entered your audio PIN, I will not be able to unmute you. So if you think you might have a question out loud, you might want to call back in and use your audio PIN. If you're using your computer mic and speakers, then you are good to go. The second option for questions would be to ask one anonymously. So there is a questions panel in the GoToWebinar toolbox as well. So if you type in a question, then I will ask that question for you, but I will not announce your name. So you can remain anonymous if you want to ask a question that way. So those are a couple of options for you for the questions. Lastly, a couple of you will be receiving Amazon gift cards in a random prize drawing after this webinar is complete. So I'll notify you later today or tomorrow if you are one of the winners of those gift cards. I believe that is all of my announcements. So let's take a look at the poll. Looks like most of you have voted. I'm going to close this out and share the results. So the question for the group, can you allow an employee to take a government vehicle home? 11% of you say no, 11% say yes, 24% say no, 58% say it depends, and 7% do not know. Well, I guess we are all going to find out the answer to this question here in a moment. So with that, I am going to turn our presentation over to the presenter for today. We have Patrick McConnell on the line. Patrick is from the GSA, Office of Government-Wide Policy, Motor Vehicle Policy, and has some great information to share with us. So Patrick, you may begin the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I greatly appreciate it. Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon. Hopefully you'll learn something. As Jessica said, with GSA, the Office of Government-Wide Policy, I've spent the better part of my 26 years in the government with the Vehicle Policy Group. So hopefully we'll all learn a little bit of something today. And I am taking, or actually I have earned the NPMA's Certified Federal Fleet Administrator designation, and going to work up to that manager spot here shortly, hopefully, knock on wood. But anyway, let's get back to home to work transportation, one of my favorite subjects in the government. All right, can you allow an employee to take a government vehicle home? As we mentioned, this is otherwise known as homework transportation, and those who answered depends on the question are right. Generally, no, but this is the government, so there are lots of exceptions, Not covered by the home to work rules, however, you'll find employees on official travel. Those under official orders can take a government vehicle home and not have to worry about it. Employees on permanent change of station travel. Same thing. They're essentially on travel, so they don't have to worry about it either. They could take a vehicle home and off to their new location. Now, employees essential for, what does that entail? Well, you might be able to guess, but that covers employees essential for the safe and efficient performance of intelligence, counterintelligence, protective services, or criminal law enforcement duties when designated in writing as such by their agency head. And of course, the head of the agency is the highest person in the agency. And it's interesting that even those even though that the home to work rules do not cover these folks, it still has to be in writing. So that's something to be aware of. These vehicles are not automatically exempt. It has to be designated in writing. So this is where it comes to depends. Allowed by the home to work rules and law: field work, clear and present danger, compelling operational consideration, and emergency. And as we go through the presentation, we'll take a look at each of those a little bit. Okay, the foundation of the home to work laws and regs. The Bible, so to speak, is the 1986 Passenger Carrier Act, Home to Work, otherwise known as 31 USC or United States Code 1344. Implementing that law is Federal Management Regulation 102-5, Home to Work Transportation. Pretty straightforward so far. And then adding some information to that regulation is FMR Bulletin B35. That's kind of fill in some of the blanks. A lot of you may remember back in the day before we went to the question and answer format that our regulations had a lot of detail that explained a lot of stuff. And when we went to the question and answer format, that detail was dropped out. So hopefully with the Home to Work Bulletin, we've added some of that detail back in. Some of the things you may not know that are related to home to work. One thing it's very interesting is the 1989 Ethics Reform Act. That covers incidental use, and the home to work regulation is the only spot in the FMR that mentions incidental use, and we'll cover that in a little bit more. Comptroller General decisions have an impact on home to work. Certainly other fleet managers' experiences. One thing to remember that the federal fleet community is tight-knit, so please feel free to ask your fellow fleet managers or even come to GSA for questions. And scope of employment determinations, we'll cover that, but oddly enough, scope of employment determinations are set up or determined by state law. So that's something to be aware of as you go through. Okay, basics of home to work. Just like designated in writing for the essential employees, the head of an agency must approve home to work for everybody that needs it. And it's allowed to cover field work and approved by a person or a specific job position, which is kind of interesting. So if your agency wants to approve it by a person, has to let the person, all that good stuff, where they're going, for how long, that kind of stuff. But what's kind of neat about this specific allowance is specific job position. So rather than having a list of people and sending that to Congress, you can have a list of positions like an inspector or contract. Somebody has to go around and ensure that contractors are doing their work, quality control specialists, meat inspectors, lots of things. So you can do that. And the fieldwork designation lasts up for 2 years. Clear and present danger. That kind of says it all right there. Instead of 2 years, though, that's good for only 15 days. Compelling operational consideration. That's an interesting one we'll cover in a few minutes. That one is also good for 15 days. And emergency, another designation that's only good for 15 days. But federal agencies have the opportunity to go back to their heads of agency and come up with extensions for these. Field work can be renewed every 2 years indefinitely. Clear and present danger, compelling operational consideration, and emergencies can be renewed for up to 90 days. And unfortunately, this is something we tried to get changed, but it wasn't working at the time. Approval authority, as we mentioned, has to be done by the head of the agency, and it may not be delegated. Though it would be great if we can get the delegation of authority down to the person responsible for the vehicle, management responsibility for the vehicle, but unfortunately, it still has to go to the head of the agency. All right. Let's look at field work. Means official work requiring the employee's presence at various locations other than his or her regular workplace. And again, that's people who must work in a circular activity, a route. Maybe they're going, like we mentioned, inspections. They're visiting lots of people without having to go into the office. So again, it's really what it means, field work. It's away from the office and getting out there where a government vehicle is the best way to go in a remote location, or it's within the acceptable commuting area of what your agency says. Sometimes it's within 50 miles, sometimes more than that, and limited use beyond the commuting area. So again, we're talking about the people that do lots of work outside of their office and don't really need to go to the office. Clear and present danger, as it kind of means, is highly unusual circumstances where the physical safety of the employee or the government property is in danger. Some caveats to that: it must be real, it must be immediate or imminent, not merely potential, and the use of government passenger carrier would provide protection not otherwise available. I would think most clear and present danger situations are probably overseas, especially when you have the need for armored vehicle, or something like that. But intelligence are always getting word of potential threats against our ambassadors or other officials out overseas. So I do think most of this is overseas activities. But you never know. It could come up in real life too, in the domestic United States. Compelling operational considerations means where circumstances, home to work transportation is essential to conduct official business or would substantially increase the federal agency's efficiency and economy. That's really, really, really broad. You may know that official business is really up to the agency, what official business means in terms of accomplishing the agency's mission. So essentially, this is really compelling operational considerations are really up to the agency, what that means. It can mean almost anything to make sure that the agency is able to conduct its mission, and maybe it can increase efficiency and economy. We'll see. That's interesting. Okay. Emergency. Basically, circumstances that exist wherever there's immediate, unforeseeable, temporary need to provide home to work transportation. This would essentially be emergencies such as a hurricane or some other natural disaster, maybe unfortunately a man-made natural disaster. Maybe it's a building management person that has to maybe there's a fire or something that is multiple days in trying to resolve the issue. Lots of things can be called emergency, but again, it has to be immediate and unforeseeable type of activity or event. One thing that's kind of interesting about home to work, we're talking about a law and regulations that were written decades ago. And one thing they don't necessarily go into are telework and virtual workers and how they relate to home to work. And it's kind of interesting because we have to refer people to their general counsel in the sense that GSA's legal office has said, oh, home to work regulations still apply. But our friends and other agencies, their general counsels have said, well, no, it doesn't apply. Home to work doesn't apply when the employee's home is their official station. It's kind of confusing, and hopefully we will go eventually to a legislative change or maybe a comptroller general decision to try to work that out. But again, we tell people to go to your general counsel and see what they say. So right now, it's basically an agency decision whether or not those teleworkers are covered by home to work. And one recommendation, of course, is to document everything to make sure that general counsel's decisions are in writing, and how the agency responds to that is also in writing, just to make sure that if someone comes knocking and wants to investigate that, you've covered yourselves very well. Okay. More not so basic basics. Reports to Congress. Agencies may not know that you must submit your home to work determinations to Congress. The top committee there is the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, and the bottom one is the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. And it really applies to new determinations in terms of agencies must report, I should say, new determinations to Congress no later than 60 calendar days after their approval. And one thing that is actually kind of cool when it comes to extensions of those requests, you may consolidate any subsequent determinations into a single report and submit them quarterly. But that's something that really needs to be done. Like I said, a lot of people don't realize that, and we just want to try to get people out of trouble. Mention incidental use. Again, incidental use means conversion or use of government property for non-official or personal activities. The regulation FMR 102-5 recommends that agencies that allow home to work also come up rules for incidental use of government vehicles. And the drivers may use the vehicle in accordance with those rules in connection with existing home to work authorization. So incidental use could be a police officer maybe going to get their uniforms laundered or dry cleaned, or stopping for lunch, or some kind of quick activity that doesn't really steer them too far away from their route or from their mission. So again, that's something that agencies have the option, but it is recommended that they come up with some policies on that. All right, still more not so basic basics. When we think about reports to Congress, some of that comes down to what's being done, and also we'll talk more about taxable benefits. But right now, to track home to work, agencies by law have to have backup documentation and driver logs. Must maintain logs or other records necessary to verify that home to work transportation was for official purposes. So each agency, although they have to do logs, they can decide at which level that those logs are maintained and kept. I know GSA, some of the logs are kept by the driver, but they are collected by they're collected by the fleet manager, who transfers them to the finance office. So the chief financial officer's office, because of taxes that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Okay, what must be in these logs? Well, the logs should be easily accessible and must contain some information to help you survive an audit. And they should contain the name and title of an employee, or the position that is being designated for home to work use. Or if the person is confidential, or you really want to hide the name, some other identification, maybe some kind of code or designated, what am I looking for? Some kind of other identification where the agency can easily identify the person, but no one else can. So you want to take those the name and title of the employee using the passenger carrier. Name and title of the person who authorized the use. Of course, that would be the agency fleet manager or the agency head of the agency, but maybe the manager who's requested that should also be identified. And then you want to identify the vehicle, the type of vehicle being used. Dates home to work transportation is authorized. So if you want field work, you want to label that 2-year time period, like say from January 2018 to January 2020 or something like that. Location of the person's residence, duration of the home to work ability, whether it be the 15 days or the 2 years, and then circumstances requiring home to work. As we mentioned, field work could be a circumstance, clear and present danger, the contingency, operational consideration, or the emergency. Okay, more not so basic basics. Accidents while using home to work transportation. This gets into what we mentioned about scope of employment. Scope of employment is a legal term that covers activity authorized by a competent authority, say a supervisor or some standard operational procedure or standard orders or directives or that kind of thing. And the employee was serving at least in part a government purpose. As we mentioned, that is important because home to work activity, if the employee is involved in an accident while using the vehicle for home to work under home to work authorization, the state in which that accident occurred actually has the overriding authority to determine if the person was acting in their scope of employment. Some of the critical components that a state may look at: time and place and occasion of the accident. One thing that we have a story about one employee who was in an accident, and why time was important. It occurred, the person was using it okay in terms of the actual activity, but the person was using it before their actual time of duty started. So because of that, just because of maybe an hour difference or half an hour, that person was found to be out of scope because they were in the accident before their tour of duty started. Some other factors that states may require or look at, and not commonly done by the employee. If it's part of the routine that the person's always doing it and doing it in that particular manner, they look at that. Was the employee departing from normal methods of the job performance? Another example could be our person involved in the accident before the duty hours. They were departing from the duty hours. Maybe instead of running a circular route for their job, maybe they took a long detour, a long scenic route, and that could be a departure. Some other things, the act could reasonably have been anticipated by the employer. So maybe as part of the job description, maybe the employer issued a particular order or email even that recognized that the employee should be doing this to further the mission. And then finally, was the employee motivated to serve the employer, or was it personal? So those are some things that are interesting, and managers and drivers alike should be aware that if they get into trouble, the scope of employment really is determined by the states and out of the hands of the government pretty much. Now, that doesn't mean the Federal Tort Claims Act won't apply, but it is impacted. Okay, another not so basic, taxable benefit. That link there describes the IRS Fringe Benefit Guide for federal, state, and local governments. And for better or for worse, home to work could be a taxable fringe benefit, and we'll talk taxes a little bit more. Mention a little bit about Comptroller General decisions. They do impact home to work. In fact, one of the reasons that home to work doesn't include government travel orders is because of a Comptroller General decision. Use of a vehicle for transportation between employee's home and an airport or other common carrier terminal in conjunction with official travel is not precluded by the home to work transportation laws. And we've taken that and said, okay, that covers basically all the travel, not just between a common carrier terminal or anything like that. And another GAO report had right now the law and the regulation was changed to allow employees to be dropped off by an employee shuttle at a mass terminal, such as a metro subway train station or a bus terminal. So these Comptroller General decisions do have an impact on home to work and other aspects of federal fleet management. One thing to be aware of is the popularity or growing popularity of telematics. You might ask, what are telematics? And they're basically onboard equipment, electronic equipment that monitor, collect, and submit data to their manager, to the agency's manager, about the vehicle performance, how the vehicle is running itself, what the driver is doing, who is the driver, and what time they took the vehicle out. Those kinds of issues. Location data, monitoring your driver to enforce official policies and to minimize incidental usage. And that those telematics may become a big factor when home to work is authorized. And I think drivers, particularly law enforcement and those drivers who regularly use home to work, should be aware that their actions will be heavily scrutinized in the future. Will telematics be involved in all vehicles? Don't know. Right now, they're very expensive. There are other issues, like if you install it on the vehicle but get rid of the vehicle, can you easily and cheaply transfer the equipment to other vehicles? Lots of issues like that to be decided upon by each agency. But again, there's something to be aware of, because they may be used to enforce home to work policies. All right. Mention taxes, and this is something that I'm not totally clear on. I've tried to do some research, and thank you to the Department of Labor. The fleet manager there has done extensive research with the IRS. I've tried to summarize her work and what little I know from that IRS publication we mentioned a few slides ago. But agencies must report the use of the government vehicle for commuting anytime there is more than one round trip of home to work commute taken during a calendar month. So in a sense, what that's saying is, if a person takes the vehicle home and returns it for that one round trip, that's not taxable. But at the bottom of the slide, if the employee takes more than one round trip in a GOV during the calendar month, all the trips taken during the calendar month are taxable and must be reported. So essentially what that means, if the person, like I mentioned, if a person takes one trip, that's fine. But if they take two trips, both trips are taxable. It's really crazy. So one of the things that I know GSA uses when it comes to taxable benefits, in accordance with the IRS commuting rule, government vehicles are used by employees for commuting have an assessed value of $1.50 for each one-way trip, unless the employee is a controlled employee, as defined by the IRS publication. And controlled employee, basically, we're talking about senior executives, level 5 or above, or an elected official. And the commuting rule basically is the distance an employee travels between the employee's home and regular workplace is a commute. And that covers field work to a degree. That covers, driving the vehicle between home and the workplace, or the regular workplace, but it also covers field work to a degree. So I know what GSA does. Their log covers the round trip and actually helps the driver calculate the potential tax liability by adding up the round trips at $3 and coming up, say, with, if there's 3 trips, it'd be $9, 12 trips, $36, those kinds of things. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that log is sent to the chief financial officer, the finance office, to help with taxes with that. So basically the bottom line is, work with your general counsel's office and work with your chief financial officer to make sure the taxes are covered. Like reporting to Congress, a lot of people don't realize that taxes are a potential for being incurred on for home to work usage. So just be aware of that. I do think law enforcement and emergency vehicles are exempt from that, from the taxable benefit. But again, check with the general counsel's office and your chief financial officer to make sure. All right. So when it comes to the role of the fleet manager, this has been a big question that has come up over the last few years. Basically, it'll be different for each agency, but we recommend that managers at least publish an internal home to work policy. Some agencies don't allow it at all. Some agencies allow it a lot. So, and I'm sure there's several agencies in between. So, along with the policy, develop a home to work approval process. And that could be several ways. GSA at one time had an automated process that the fleet manager could put a request in the system, and that system would automatically work the request up through all the approving officials right up to the our administrator, head of the agency. So that was pretty cool. But some agencies do a totally paper process, so that's something that can be done. Develop the driver logs for tracking mechanisms. GSA uses paper right now, but I think so as technology progresses, or even the telematics get to a point, all that driver activity could be done electronically. Or maybe some agencies are using an app, a phone application, or some other electronic way. And particularly easy if you have more of a motor pool or some kind of checking out system where you check the vehicle out and hit the road with it. Like I mentioned, though, the bottom line is work with the chief financial officer and the general counsel with regards to the potential tax liability. Again, a lot of agencies don't realize that home to work can incur a potential tax liability as a fringe benefit. So that's something that's very important. I know I repeated myself several times on that, but I think it just emphasizes the importance that taxes are. We don't really want the agency to put the employee in a bad spot for whatever reason. Okay, I think that's it. So let's open up to questions, Jessica.
Sounds good. Yes, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and either type those into the questions panel or raise your hand icon. And I do have a couple lined up here for you. So the first question is, as a contractor, who would be the approving authority, the government or project manager?
It would actually be the contracting officer of that contract. And I think, and I'll have to find out for this, but I'm not totally sure if the contracting officer needs to go to the head of the agency for that, but the contracting officer is definitely involved. So not the project manager, but the government's contracting officer.
Great, thank you very much. Our next question, this is a little bit of a longer one, so bear with me here. Under a cost type contract for a government-owned vehicle, whether contractor acquired or government furnished, and the government has contractual title to the vehicle, should the title be in the contractor's name or government's name?
Oh, the title. I think, can you repeat the last part of the question again about the fixed cost? You're breaking up a little bit there.
All right, okay, so Patrick, can you mute the speakers on your computer? Sorry, I think that's causing the echo. Okay, I think this will be clearer now. Okay, I'll just repeat the question. Under a cost type contract for a government-owned vehicle, whether contractor acquired or government furnished, and the government has contractual title to the vehicle, should the title be in the contractor's name or government's name?
That is a good question, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure of that. The government doesn't use a title. I'll have to get back to on that. If they could send me an email. My email address is on the cover of the presentation, and then here at vehicle.policy@gsa.gov.
Very good. Thank you. If there are any other questions, go ahead and get those in now. I do see a note about the slideshow. If anyone would like a copy of the presentation, I would be happy to send that to you as well. All right, I think that wraps it up. Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. Oh, wait, we have one more question. Sorry.
Okay, great.
Okay, so the question is, commercial carriers are now regulated to provide an e-log tracking system for commercial carriers. Shouldn't the government use a similar device for government vehicles?
That is a great idea, actually. It's a cost issue. It falls under that telematics portion of it, and hopefully, like I mentioned, some agencies may already do that, but I don't know that we can require that across the board. But it's a great idea. Like I mentioned, it's probably up to each agency how they implement that. Like I mentioned, GSA is a paper process, but the other agencies may have found a way to move that to the electronic world. But again, each agency will be different, as I don't think we can mandate that kind of technology across the board.
Great. Thanks very much. And thank you, everyone, for calling in today. We will be posting this presentation on NPMA's YouTube channel. So if you missed anything and you want to hear it again, feel free to go to that channel and take a look at the presentation probably sometime tomorrow. That will be up. But thank you again, Patrick, for taking the time to present for us today. This was very informational.
No problem. Thank you for having me. And everybody, please feel free to fire off questions or comments to the vehicle.policy@gsa.gov or my personal email too. So thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.